The night was cold in Mendocino County, California. March 1st, 1980. A small, remote coastal town called Manchester, population barely 200 souls, sat wrapped in darkness and ocean fog. And inside a one-room cabin on the edge of that forgotten place, a 14-year-old boy stood completely still, listening. He was listening for the sound of a car engine fading into the distance. Listening for the moment silence meant safety. His name, the name he had slowly, painfully begun to remember, was Stephen. Not Dennis. Not Parnell. Stephen. And on this night, he had made a decision that would take everything he had left inside him to carry out. Beside him stood a 5-year-old boy named Timothy, who had been crying for his mother for 2 weeks straight. 2 weeks of watching this little boy weep and call out for a home he couldn't find had broken something open in Stephen. Something that 7 years of psychological torture, manipulation, and abuse had not been able to fully extinguish. Stephen picked up the small boy. He carried him on his back out the cabin door and into the cold California night. And together, the two of them, a traumatized teenager and a weeping toddler, stepped onto the road and started walking toward the highway, hoping someone, anyone, would stop. What happened next would stun an entire nation. But to understand how it got here, how a 7-year-old boy disappeared from a California suburb and didn't come home for 8 years, we have to go back. All the way back to a December afternoon in 1972, when the world was a simpler and more naive place, and a freckle-faced second grader walked home from school and stepped into one of the most disturbing cases in American history. Before we dive in, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. If you enjoy true crime stories like this, be sure to like the video, subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and share it with someone who'd love it too. Stephen Gregory Stayner was born on April 18, 1965, in Merced, California, a modest farming city in the Central Valley, hemmed in by almond groves and peach orchards and the distant shadows of Yosemite National Park. He was the third of 5 children born to Delbert and Kay Stayner, a working-class couple doing exactly what millions of American families were doing in the early 1970s, raising their kids, paying their bills, and trusting that the world around them was basically safe. Stephen was a quiet, good-natured kid. Freckles across his nose. A gap in his front teeth. He liked riding his bike, hanging out with neighborhood friends, and the kind of uncomplicated childhood pleasures that defined growing up in small-town California in that era. His family described him as sweet and mild-tempered, a boy who didn't cause much trouble and didn't demand much attention. He had an older brother named Carrie, 3 younger sisters, a tight-knit extended family, and a life that, in every measurable way, was ordinary and whole. His mother, Kay, was warm and devoted. His father, Del, was a man of the era, stoic, hard-working, not particularly expressive, but present. The family home sat in a quiet neighborhood, the kind where children walked to school by themselves without anyone thinking twice about it. Because in 1972, that was normal. Children were trusted to move freely through the world. The concept of stranger danger had not yet lodged itself into the American psyche. Missing children did not appear on milk cartons. Parents did not track their children's every move. The world felt safer than it was. And somewhere 2 hours away, at the Yosemite Lodge Resort, a man named Kenneth Eugene Parnell had already begun to plan the worst day of the Stayner family's life. Parnell was 40 years old in 1972, a Texas-born drifter with deep, dark eyes and a history that law enforcement had inexcusably failed to act on. He had already spent 3.5 years in San Quentin State Prison for molesting an 8-year-old boy. He had done additional time in a Utah prison for armed robbery and grand larceny. He had convictions for impersonating a police officer. Psychologists who evaluated him over the years noted he had shown signs of severe disturbance since childhood. And yet, in 1972, he was working as a night auditor at the Yosemite Lodge, living freely among the public, with no one watching him and no legal obligation to register as a sex offender. At the lodge, Parnell befriended a fellow employee named Irvin Edward Murphy, a gentle, easily influenced man who later claimed he believed Parnell was an aspiring minister with a kind heart. Parnell told Murphy he wanted to raise a boy in a religious-type deal. He told him he was thinking about fostering a child. Murphy, either credulous or willfully blind to what was really being asked of him, agreed to help. The two men climbed into Parnell's large white Buick one December morning and drove into Merced. They brought a stack of religious pamphlets with them. They drove slowly through school zones and residential streets, watching children walking home. December 4th, 1972, was a Monday. The weather was gray and sleety, the kind of cold, damp California winter day that makes everything feel muted and quiet. Stephen Stayner, 7 years old, had spent his morning at Charles Wright Elementary School like any other school day. He left in the afternoon with a classmate, walking along Highway 140 toward home. His classmate peeled off toward his own house. Stephen continued alone. He was on a sidewalk, a short distance from his family's home, when Irvin Murphy approached him on foot. Murphy told the boy he was a representative of a church and was looking for donations. He asked if Stephen's mother would have anything to give. Stephen, polite, trusting, doing exactly what well-raised children in 1972 were taught to do when an adult spoke to them, said that yes, he thought she probably would. Murphy suggested they go together to check. And then, as if on cue, Parnell's white Buick pulled up beside them. Murphy and Stephen got in. Stephen later recalled the exact moment he realized something was wrong. As Parnell drove, he passed the street where Stephen lived. "You drove past my house," the boy told him. The two men said they would just call his parents when they got to where they were going, to see if it was okay if he spent the night. So Parnell stopped at a payphone on Highway 140. He stepped out of the car. He pretended to make a call. He came back and looked Stephen in the eyes and said, "Your parents. I just spoke to them. They don't want you anymore." 7 years old. Sitting in the back seat of a stranger's car on a gray December afternoon, 3 weeks before Christmas. And a grown man was telling him that his mother and father had decided they didn't want him. What happened inside that little boy in that moment? Parnell drove Stephen to a rented cabin in Cathy's Valley, in Mariposa County, a remote, sparsely populated area where nobody knew them and nobody would ask questions. He told the boy that a judge had granted him legal custody. He told him he was being adopted. He gave him a new name, Dennis Gregory Parnell. From now on, he said, Stephen's name was Dennis. He was Parnell's son, and the life he had lived before, his mother, his father, his brother Carrie, his sisters, his bedroom with its unopened Christmas presents, was gone. What happened in that cabin is documented, in Stephen's own words, in interviews he gave years later. Parnell molested him on the very first night. He began raping him 13 days later. The abuse was relentless, methodical, and accompanied by calculated psychological manipulation that researchers today would recognize as a textbook coercive control pattern. Parnell alternated severe beatings with moments of what he called spoiling, giving Stephen gifts, letting him drink alcohol and smoke cigarettes, treating him like a companion when it suited him and a victim when it didn't. The kindness and the cruelty were both weapons. Meanwhile, back in Merced, the Stayner family's world had fallen apart. Kay Stayner had expected her son home from school that afternoon. When he didn't arrive, she waited. She called neighbors. She called the school. She called other parents. As darkness fell, and Stephen still hadn't appeared, she and Dell called police. Officers searched the neighborhood. They canvassed the area. They found nothing. No witness, no physical evidence, no sign of struggle. No one had seen a thing. Stephen had simply walked around a corner and vanished from the face of the earth. The flyers went up almost immediately. A school photo of Stephen, gap-toothed and bright-eyed, with information about the day he disappeared. The family posted them everywhere. Dell Stayner would later tell reporters that for years afterward, every time he saw a crowd scene on television, every time he opened a magazine and saw a photograph of a large group of people, he scanned the faces. All of them. Every single time. Looking for his son. "I never stopped looking," he said. The family held on to his Christmas presents. They didn't open them, and they didn't throw them away. They kept them, wrapped, waiting. And here's where the story takes a turn that makes the stomach drop. It was later discovered that Stephen's family had sent missing person flyers to schools all across California. Flyers with Stephen's face and description on them. And some of those flyers had been sent to the very schools that Kenneth Parnell had enrolled Dennis Parnell in. Teachers may have passed these flyers around. Administrators may have seen them. And somehow, in every case, no one made the connection. No one looked at the quiet, freckled boy sitting in the classroom and said, "Wait." Over the next several years, Parnell moved frequently, from Mariposa County to Ukiah, to Manchester to Compton, town to town through the rural patchwork of California, always staying one step ahead of anything that might look too closely. He posed as a single father raising his son Dennis. He enrolled the boy in local schools under his false identity. He gave him just enough freedom to appear normal. For a period, a woman named Barbara Mathias came to live with them. According to Stephen's later accounts, Mathias participated in his abuse as well, joining Parnell in sexually assaulting him when he was approximately 9 years old. She later claimed she had no idea the boy had been kidnapped. She was never arrested. At school, and this detail speaks to something almost unbearable about human resilience, Stephen thrived in the way that lonely, displaced children sometimes do. He was described by classmates as funny and spirited, a kid who genuinely wanted to play and be included. A girl named Lori Duke, who dated him in high school knowing him only as Dennis, later said he had a great personality and was spunky. There was something in him that refused to be completely extinguished. Even in the darkest captivity, something in Stephen Stayner kept reaching toward the light. But he had been told, over and over, in 100 different ways, that his family didn't want him. And when the doubt crept in, as it eventually must for any intelligent, growing child, he tried to find evidence that it wasn't true. He scanned newspapers. He watched television news. He looked for any sign that his parents were searching for him. And when he found nothing, because the media coverage of a missing child from 1972 didn't follow him to rural Mendocino County years later, it reinforced the lie. He later told Newsweek, "I'd ask myself, Mom and Dad, where the hell are you?" It somehow reinforced the lie that Parnell told me they didn't want me. As Stephen entered puberty, something shifted in Parnell's behavior. The abuse continued, but Parnell's interest began to cool. He started talking about wanting a younger child. He had tried and failed at other kidnappings over the years. On several occasions, he had even attempted to use Stephen as an accomplice, sending the teenager to lure younger boys toward his car. Every single attempt failed. Parnell blamed Stephen, called him incompetent, berated him for not completing the task. Stephen never told Parnell the truth, that he had sabotaged every single one of those attempts on purpose. Every single one. Think about what that means for a moment. A boy who had been psychologically dismantled by a predator since the age of 7. A boy who had been told his parents didn't want him, who had been isolated from every person who could have helped him, who had been given no formal therapy and no roadmap for escape, found the moral clarity, in the middle of his own survival crisis, to protect other children from the fate he had endured. He sabotaged those kidnappings quietly, invisibly, at personal risk to himself, because somewhere underneath all the layers of trauma and manipulation, his conscience was still intact. But on February 14, 1980, Valentine's Day, Parnell didn't use Stephen this time. He used a different teenager, Randall Sean Porman, a school friend of Stephen's, who later claimed he didn't know the full nature of what Parnell was asking him to do. Together, Parnell and Porman drove to Ukiah, where they found 5-year-old Timothy White walking home from his elementary school. They took him, just like that. History repeating itself with sickening precision. Timothy White came to the cabin crying. He cried for his mother. He cried for his home. He cried with the specific, inconsolable grief of a 5-year-old child who has no idea why everything familiar has been taken from him. And Stephen Stayner, 14 years old, watched the little boy cry and felt something crack open in his chest. He knew exactly what was coming for Timothy. He knew what the first night would look like, and the night after that, and the years that would follow. He had lived it. "I was not going to let that child go through what I had already been through," he said later. "And if I didn't take care of it now, it would just get worse." For 2 weeks, Stephen watched and waited. Parnell worked a night shift as a clerk at the Palace Hotel in Ukiah. He left the cabin each evening, trusting that Stephen, who had been allowed to come and go with relative freedom for years, and who had never tried to run, would stay put. Parnell had built that trust deliberately. It was part of the design. He had given Stephen just enough latitude to make escape seem unnecessary, while never allowing him the clarity to realize that escape was exactly what he needed. But on the night of March 1, 1980, Parnell left for work and Stephen Stayner made his move. He gathered Timothy White. He picked up the 5-year-old and carried him on his back. He walked out of the cabin and into the darkness and fog of the Mendocino coast, and began hitchhiking toward Ukiah, 40 miles away. A driver picked them up. then another. Stephen gave a cover story, telling drivers they were brothers trying to get home to their family. He was a 14-year-old boy with a 5-year-old on his back, moving through the California night toward a police station, with no guarantee that anyone would believe him or help him, or that this wasn't going to somehow blow up in his face. But they made it to Ukiah. After failing to locate Timothy's home address in the early morning hours, the two boys walked into the Ukiah Police Department just past midnight. Officers on duty looked at a tall, thin teenager and a small weeping child and asked what was going on. Stephen sat down. He wrote a statement in his own hand. It was brief. It was matter-of-fact. And the opening line has since become one of the most quietly devastating sentences in the history of American true crime. He wrote, "My name is Stephen Stayner. I am 14 years of age. I don't know my true birth date, but I use April 18th, 1965. I know my first name is Stephen. I'm pretty sure my last is Stayner, and if I have a middle name, I don't know it." He didn't even know his own name with certainty. He wasn't sure how to spell it. 7 years of being called Dennis Parnell had erased so much of who he was that even his own identity was something he could only tentatively claim. "I know my first name is Stephen." That sentence. By daybreak on March 2nd, 1980, Kenneth Parnell had been arrested on suspicion of abducting both boys. When police ran his background, they found the prior sodomy conviction from 1951. They found the criminal record stretching back decades. They found a man who should never, under any reasonable application of the law and public safety, have been free to walk among children. Both boys were reunited with their families that day. The nation erupted. The media descended on Merced. Television cameras flooded the Stayner family home. On March 14th, 1980, Stephen appeared on Good Morning America, sitting between his parents, looking healthy but wary, like a young man who had not yet decided how much of himself to reveal to the world. He said it was great to be back. He said his siblings had changed a lot. "I never recognized either one of them." But behind the cameras, the reunion was complex in ways the media didn't fully capture. Stephen had been away for 7 years. He was a teenager who had been allowed to smoke, drink, and operate without structure or parental authority. He returned to a family home with rules and schedules and expectations, and a father who, upon learning the full nature of what had been done to his son, responded by closing off. Del Stayner, a man of his generation, struggled deeply with what had happened to Stephen. Rather than moving toward his son with comfort, he pulled back. The counseling that Stephen so desperately needed was refused. Del reportedly said his son didn't need therapy, that he would just get on with his life. And so Stephen tried to get on with his life. He returned to school, where other kids treated him as a curiosity at best and mocked him at worst. When the details of the sexual abuse became known, revealed in part when police found sexualized photographs of Stephen during the search of Parnell's home, some of his peers taunted him with homophobic slurs. His father's physical affection disappeared entirely. Stephen later said to Newsweek, "Why doesn't my dad hug me anymore? I guess 7 years changed him too. Everything has changed. Sometimes I blame myself. I don't know sometimes if I should have come home. Would I have been better off if I didn't?" That question. The tragedy of that question. He eventually dropped out of high school. He drank heavily. He moved through relationships and jobs with the restlessness of someone who has never been given the tools to be still. He was eventually asked to leave the family home. And yet, and this is important, he also turned outward. He spoke to child safety groups. He gave interviews about personal safety and stranger danger. He gave a face and a voice to something that most of American society was still learning to talk about. He worked at a local pizza shop. In 1985, at age 20, he married a 17-year-old woman named Jody Edmondson, and together they had 2 children, a daughter named Ashley and a son named Stephen Jr. By the late 1980s, Stephen Stayner's story had become something of a cultural touchstone. A 2-part NBC miniseries called I Know My First Name is Stephen aired in May 1989 and drew an average of 35.8 million viewers over 2 nights. Critics called it an exception to the usual exploitative TV dramatizations. It was nominated for multiple Emmy Awards and Golden Globes. And Stephen, now 24 years old and living in Merced with his wife and children and a job at a pizza restaurant, watched his own story unfold on national television. The night before the Emmy Awards broadcast, Stephen Stayner was riding his motorcycle home from work. He was not wearing a helmet. A car driven by a man named Antonio Lora pulled out from a migrant labor camp entrance on September 16, 1989, and Stevens' motorcycle collided with it. He sustained fatal head injuries and died less than an hour later. He was 24 years old. He was buried in Merced District Cemetery beside his grandparents. 450 people attended his funeral. The pallbearers included Timothy White, now 14 years old, the same age Stephen had been when he carried that little boy out of the darkness on his back. Delbert Stayner, who had spent years unable to reach across the gulf that trauma had opened between himself and his son, told reporters afterward, "It's final this time." The weight of those 3 words. Kenneth Parnell was tried in 1981 in 2 separate trials, one for each boy, and sentenced to 7 years in prison, the maximum California law allowed at the time. He served 5 before being paroled. The sexual assaults on Stephen, hundreds of them, spanning 7 years, were never prosecuted. Some fell outside jurisdictional boundaries. Others were outside the statute of limitations. The Mendocino County prosecutors simply chose not to pursue the charges they had jurisdiction over. Irvin Murphy served 2 years of a 5-year sentence. Barbara Mathias was never charged. Sean Porman served time in a juvenile work camp. And Kenneth Parnell walked out of prison in 1985, the same year Stephen Stayner was getting married. He lived quietly for years. Until January 2003, when he was arrested in Berkeley, California, at the age of 71, for attempting to pay his caregiver's sister $500 to obtain a 4-year-old boy. She had gone to the police immediately. Recorded phone calls captured his intent in excruciating detail. He was convicted in 2004 under California's 3 strikes law and sentenced to 25 years to life. The prosecutor told the jury, "He has been a danger to children his entire life." During closing arguments, he showed the jury a photo of Stephen labeled 1, a photo of Timothy labeled 2, and a blank screen labeled 3, representing the child that Parnell would have taken next. Kenneth Parnell died in prison on January 21, 2008, at the California Medical Facility in Vacaville. He was 76 years old. There is an epilogue to this story that adds a layer of almost incomprehensible darkness, and it concerns Stephen's older brother, Cary Stayner, the brother who had been at home during all of those years, the one who had grown up as the kid whose brother was kidnapped, had always been described by people who knew him as unsettling, withdrawn, unable to form relationships with women, compulsively pulling his hair out in clumps. His sister Corey later said he had been unwell since he was a toddler. In 1999, while working as a handyman at a lodge near Yosemite, the same park that had employed the man who kidnapped Stephen, Cary Stayner murdered 4 women over the course of several months. He confessed. He was convicted and sentenced to death for the murders of Carol Sund, Julie Sund, Sylvina Palazzo, and Joie Armstrong. One family, one household in a quiet California farming town, surrounded by almond groves and peach orchards. And inside it, 2 brothers who were each, in entirely different ways, destroyed by what Kenneth Parnell set in motion on December 4, 1972. This case changed laws. California amended its legislation after Stephen's kidnapping to allow for consecutive prison terms in similar abduction cases. The missing children movement, the milk carton campaigns, the stranger danger education programs, the systems for rapid reporting and national awareness, grew in part from cases like Stephen's. Something structural shifted in how America thought about its children, about their vulnerability, and about the failures of systems that were supposed to protect them. But none of those changes brought Stephen Stayner back. None of them returned to him the 7 years that were stolen, or repaired the relationship with a father who didn't know how to hold him, or gave him the therapy he was owed. He lived 24 years on this earth. He spent 7 of them in captivity, several more struggling to reassemble himself from the pieces that remained, and a handful more, the final ones, building something that looked, from the outside, like a real life. He left behind a wife. He left behind a daughter named Ashley and a son named Stephen Jr. He left behind a nation that had briefly fallen in love with the idea of him as a hero, which he was, but had not reckoned fully with the cost of the heroism, or with what it meant to have survived something like that, and still be expected to function, to heal, to simply move on. He also left behind that single sentence, written in his own hand on a yellow legal pad in a police station in Ukiah, California, at 1 o'clock in the morning, with a 5-year-old boy asleep on a chair nearby. I know my first name is Stephen. After everything, after 7 years of being told he was Kenneth Parnell, after the manipulation and the abuse and the isolation and the lies, he still knew that much. He still knew his first name was Stephen. And he came home, not just for himself. He came home because he couldn't bear to let another child suffer what he had suffered. He had every reason the world could possibly offer to look away, to protect himself, to do nothing. And he didn't. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the children still out there, about the survivors still carrying things no one should have to carry, please like this video, leave a comment, and share it with someone who needs to hear Stephen's name today. Subscribe to this channel if you haven't already, because we're going to keep telling these stories with the truth and the care they deserve. Stephen Gregory Stayner. Born April 18, 1965. Stolen December 4, 1972. Found March 2, 1980. Gone again September 16, 1989. 24 years old. A husband. A father. A boy who came home. Remember his name.